When Liszt founded the academy that now carries his name in Budapest, he implemented pedagogically for pianists and performers in general to study composition, and for composers to study instrument playing, mainly piano. And already the schism had started. Publishers, editors, scholars, musicologists established rules, styles, aesthetics about performances of music of the past away from their own time period, and created traditions through techniques which are applied for piano playing according to these aesthetics: Russian school, French school, German school, and Polish school, and many schools in the 19th century in Europe. And Liszt, being a pan-European, Hungarian by origin and Germanic by and French by intellect, as well as a Roman Catholic, and speaking Latin and reading and being open to philosophies of the Enlightenment and beyond in the Romantic era, was teaching the invented by him concept of masterclass group teaching, where he was speaking about interpretation as an oeuvre over the oeuvre. But in fact, to students of his, the famous ones that we know, which in fact were composers anyway, because that was the tradition which started to be disappearing and was lost in the 20th century's second half especially. The fact of the two combinations of the creativity within the rendering of a text and the fact of the faithfulness to the text when rendering it, as teachers teach to performers to perform, I think it's almost separating the oeuvre from the involvement in which we place ourselves as performers, as propagandators, was not the right word, but faithfuls who believe in a style, in an idiom, in an aesthetic, and we defend it. Actors defend the characters that they embody according to the roles they play. And the rupture of disbelief happens when their character is believable, not because they fake it, not because they lie to us by being what they are, who they are not, but because they transform themselves in the work they are representing through their character. And same way for musicians, the idea that we are not the composer, but we play the piece during the moment of performance, ephemerally rebuilding structures that disappear as soon as played, but nevertheless leave trace in people's souls. It's like perfumes, if that was the soul, and harmonic progressions and technical approaches, that would be the close and the nourishment. But there is the essence of the work that is separate from the composer or the author themselves. Of course, when they were alive playing their own music, it was hard to imagine somebody asking Liszt, Chopin, or Rachmaninoff if they played the right interpretation of their work. Of course, they played their own. A parent sees their child as they think they know best because of the connection and the sequence of events that led to the birth, and therefore the afterbirth education. And so when somebody else comes to cross the path of this grown child, they don't go through the point of view of the parent, they go from their point of view of the meeting of the soul of the people. Same thing. The analogy with, in my opinion, is to get to know a piece of music away from its composer, even if through the faithfulness to the texts we try to be closest to the intention of the composer, but while we play it, it becomes our own. Not that we hijack it or we have the right to use it as a template from which we build our own piece over it. As Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me, if you don't like it or don't understand it, rather write your own, or then try to understand the intent in the piece as written. And it's easy to be critical, but it's also healthy. Not doesn't mean that you will give up on being faithful to the text and play the exact chosen note in the chosen rhythm. And even if the indication isn't precise, because sometimes grace notes being not measured can be shorter or longer depending of the taste, and then you build that taste and you build this aesthetic awareness by a whole philosophical approach of the painting, of the philosophing, of the geopolitical situation of the time of the composition of the music that you play. In other words, you don't just play notes that you recite faithfully from a text that you trust to a publisher with teachers who repeat it for you to rehearse it, rehear, and therefore compete with other pianists in competitions where the essence of it is to basically not involve yourself in the statement that the music produces in the storytelling or whatever it is vehicle to the piece, even away from its time period or away from the context of its composition, to the extent of your awareness of it. But it is in its present, and it's not museum factors. We don't play old music like we visit an artifact. It is in the daily life of a student and the daily life of a performer, composer, to share with audiences, today more electronically than before, but nevertheless, the sense of communality that comes from either a culture, either combination of cultures. So because of that heterogeneity, it's wonderful to bring different points of view on an aesthetic view, away even of its own, not necessarily betraying it, but adopting it and perhaps giving it another, of course, instrumental quality. When the instruments evolve, the electronic way of communicating or capturing music, the microphones close up to the piano, the dynamic ranges. What is a mezzo forte in Haydn and what is a mezzo forte in Scriabin? Obviously, it's not the same because the texture, the resonance, the instrumental usage, the polyphony, the chordal progressions, the concept of consonance, dissonance that evolved so much through time. As Mademoiselle used to say in a conference in the 20s in Rice University, according to the transcript, the consonance of today was the dissonance of yesterday, and vice versa. Basically, we are in a tonal, post-tonal system with a possible tone-centered world where we have some hierarchies, but not necessarily all between dominants, tonics, subdominants, but or then totally atonal and all sensorial or all intellectual construction with new order of notes from which we build our development of thoughts. Factually, composition used to be a lot about developing a motif, a thematic material, combining it, developing it, and then laying it together in agreement at the end. That was a sonata form, but the fugue is more about generating its own through the voices where people converse in agreement and sometimes in disagreement, that is organized with the delays of the resolutions that create tensions and releases with the dissonances that need consonances. And then modern music has dissonances that is its own consonance, doesn't need every release into a consonance. And the awareness of the different styles that we can play today on a different instrument than the one for which they were done, or ears for which they were heard, or necessities for which they were expected, lives the essence of the thought of the storytelling that betrayed or enhanced or misunderstood still is relevant for the people who are your contemporaries, with whom you say, oh, Bach is that. And then, of course, if you play on original instruments with original inclination of the intervals and the gestures and the phrasings and the organization of the thoughts with the uneven delayed note for the expected emotional note, jeu inégal, uneven, played on the harpsichord, on the piano with a percussive instrument that's no more the plucked instrument that the harpsichord was. You had different points of expressing the emotion by giving accents or giving dynamic effects or coloring or delaying with slower tempi the decay, which allowed then to have different way of organizing the foreground and the background of the elements of the texture. But altogether, composers like Debussy didn't consider the importance of developing a theme. They were just a sensorial laboratory of emotions and of combinations with nature sounds or moods or feels of the wind, of the air, a bit like sound paintings and not necessarily impressionist because of the misunderstanding of the word between French and English, which led to think, but symbolism through poetry. And each time period, the Romantic era with the Sturm und Drang and the dramatic change of mood and the long sentences that were structuring the narrative style of the literature translated in music by Schumann, Schubert, and Fauré, and compared to Haydn, Beethoven, or let's early Beethoven, structured phrases with group of 4 bars. And so the stylistic evolution brings us to understand how art needs to question the status quo and create its own time period. Of course, most of the performers, composers of the time which we play today, centuries later, were contemporaries of their time, modern or at least relevant of their time, misunderstood or revolutionary or traditionalists, regardless of how they adapted or transformed the tonal system they inherited to express their melodic line, the perfume, or the harmonic line, the coding, or whichever analogies one can use with taste for food, cooking, or painting with colors, or imagine shapes or structure or construction, or the form as an architecture. And music is a coherent style of language that expresses its own statement within its language. But of course, if you don't speak the language, you don't have the syntax and the grammar of it, you can misunderstand it for another. And a Scriabin piece performed with an expression of Fauré's piece with the Scriabin way, you get some expressionistic instead of some impressionistic. So you can have a loss in translation of the meaning, but the meaning isn't single. It is what you make it. And so in order to develop it, Liszt thought it was wise to also keep your creativity, regardless if you are full-time composer or considered so, or considering yourself so, when you perform, or a pianist. Not because you will take freedoms with the text compared to the performers who won't compose, which is sort of what today is implied when somebody tells, for instance, me, oh, you play as a composer, and it sounds almost like a disease. Just joking. But factually, it sounds like because you do compose, then therefore you take with a grain of salt what the composer wrote. But no, I don't believe so. Personally, I'm as close to the text as I wish to cherish it, to serve it, and therefore to serve the muse with honesty and integrity. but not necessarily in recitation, also by seeing how it could have gone differently and accept to find the meaning of how to make it meaningful through the way it is. Not because I question it, but because it's a curiosity. It's a healthy curiosity, like scientists question the status quo to advance science. So are the curious minds who try to understand how things are done, how they function. And not everybody is needing to know how it functions, but it helps. So in a way, the composer's thought is their own and their interpretation isn't exhaustive. After all, other points of view can exist on the same work. And some composers are like Ravel, considering it a betrayal to add a different interpretation, thinking the text by itself tells it what it is. Yes and no. Yes, because it's very precise. No, because it isn't precise enough. And leaves room either through rubato or the pulse or the phrasing or the expression of a specific note, how you organize your climax or anticlimactically, or how do you organize the sentence's flow. Do you have breath that imitates the statement of something said with lyrics, even if there are no lyrics in sound instrumental music playing? There are different ways to inhabit the world of the text that you express. Just like actors do monologues or theater plays, they enter the tempo of the speech and how do you delay specific words because you want to give them a meaning. And then you have directors and teachers who tell you how to not overplay, underplay, overstate, understate. It's a quest for the right taste, which is not unique, but is something that you reach by your own conclusion, even by comparing with others or compared to others. And today, more than before, in this time, there were no competitions. Today is only competitions, which tends to make the playing more standardized because the editions, because the recordings, because the expectation of variety of jury members to satisfy a minimal involvement in the piece, because for some the rubato is too much, for some is not enough, for some it shouldn't even be. And they agree to disagree, but they vote and they judge, and then somebody wins, and then they have a career or not, or because of their creativity in their repertoire or their own awareness of less well played pieces, or because they play very convincingly the famous pieces. And you can see people winning 8th or 9th prize in some international competition in the 60s and having an incredible career through their life of developing through recordings and teaching and concerts. And you would say, how come they didn't deserve that? Because there is no room for everybody. And if you compare uncomparables, you end up by having a subjective opinion on an objective pattern of a competition, which is basically a sport. And sport has factual elements to determine who wins. Fast, slow, distant, far. And of course, an artistic aspect enters in some, like figure skating, but not in many sports. It's the factual thing. In piano playing in a competition, you have to have conviction in those who play that bring you to understand what it is meaningful to them. And then you can disagree as a jury member with your experience, knowledge, and traditions, and not necessarily the ones of your colleagues in the jury. But you also can agree to disagree with the fact that you wouldn't approach this way, but that way by this candidate is so valuable, that's so connecting to the audience, and not for bad reasons necessarily, because it might be not the arguments that you would like to be the demonstration of the piece's essence, but it can be seen from a different point of view. And as long as there is that, but because that approach of personal involvement in the interpretation through an awareness of the composition or composition by yourself or not, because most pianists today don't compose and very few of the composers play. And I speak play other than just try to push the buttons. And therefore, this early specialization in niches, in directions between scholarly knowledge and performer knowledge, and then or know-how, and composition in organization of thoughts compared to the performer who plays the thoughts. If it's the same person, it appears to those who don't compose that it's less of a pianist or less of a composer, depending on from which point of view you place yourself, because it's considered that several trades are necessarily more superficial than a single in-depth. Possibly, but it depends of the individuals. And I think the education creates also these grooves at the get-go by separating the makers from the thinkers, and the makers from the creators, and the creators from the performers. And if Liszt thought so, I think is because that tradition kept alive the healthy questioning of what you love and how you want to bring it to its best. And that's how I think it's valuable to have interpretations which are not a piece over the piece, but a statement which evolves with its interpretation. After all, okay, today we record, so it's not ephemeral like it used to be, but there is an ephemeral element to music making compared to painting, which is in the eye of the beholder who watches the same painting and gathers with knowledge of history of art differently the amount of awareness of what they're seeing, regardless if it's figurative or not. And it's in music, it's what it means to you, but it depends who is telling it to you. If not, people will sit down in the hall to read the music silently together and hear inside their heads differently what it means to them, like reading a book on your own and not necessarily having to have somebody read it in group. So you have a connection with the author and the imagination of the characters, and you start traveling in your imagination as a reader, and then somebody adapts the book on a film or a video game today, and you go, oh, but that's not exactly how I heard it, imagined it, visualized it, or didn't insist on this character or this part of the action. And how come? Because you have to make choices when you adapt something that comes from one idiom to another, from the reading to the watching, from the storytelling through opera or through a novel or through a film and or series of film, and then how the statement of the storytelling is diluted in episodes or stressed in few minutes, and you have to make choices. And therefore, it's a subjective choice of what you bring out. It's not cataloging the whole storytelling. And I think that even if we play a Beethoven sonata, we have to know the others. We have to know the other sonatas. We have to know the other trios, quartets of Beethoven. We have to know how that oeuvre comes, this piece comes from an oeuvre. And the oeuvre being opera, symphony, quartet, trio, mass, sacred work, therefore technical studies, instrumental approach. And then you extract it from the whole, not on its own, like a little piece of this, a little piece of that, and then you play 3 or 4 centuries in a recital on the same instrument for which none of them were written. People perhaps don't know what to expect if the legato is by finger or is used with the right foot pedal, but the damper's up, it blurs. But if it's without blurring, with finger legato, like Chopin used to do a lot, and not only since, but many don't anymore so much, use substitutions to create finger legato between the notes, the singing that is without the blur of the 88 dampers up, inevitably then sounds dry aesthetically to some, because they're used to it and they don't know that it could be that way, and they don't know which might be the right way. And if they like it by somebody who played it blurry, and if it's too loud, put the una corda, the left pedal, to hear it a little bit more muffled. But if you play inside the keys under the escapement, and you obtain this clarity of tone projecting the whisper without to be darkened by the unicorda of moving of the strings for the hammers to hit only two or instead of the three strings. You can say that it's very effective, and it is. And the audiences who don't have criteria don't know how to appreciate a finger legato or a finger pianissimo rather than a left foot pianissimo effect, even if needed sometimes for subito, but nevertheless not on the long run. And the quality of the statement of the legato, of the connection, either is over legato, air legato, breathing, wet staccato, tenuto. So many subtleties in the touch that the pianist sculpts the keyboard through the texture of what they heard and read of the score, and of course compared to how others read and heard the score. Agree, disagree, too fast, too slow, those obvious things. But beyond that is the pace, the space that you create, the dispositions, the resonances, how the harmonics evolve in their resonances differently when a chord is bunched or is spread, and how the dispositions in Schumann are different from Beethoven or Brahms, and the syncopations of Schumann with the syntax of the verb at the end of the sentence creates this expectation with incredibly intense syncopated harmonic progression that keeps us in a suspension mode of expectation, and then we find finally the release and unsettled, settled, syncopated, or brisk change of meter, as 20th century music did a lot with downbeat for everything, no upbeat to enter a downbeat. And you can find so many aspects of the language of a given composer's sound painting that you can be using one aspect more than another. But while you learn it, you dialogue with the text, you dialogue with indirectly the composer. Why did you do that? It's not comfortable to basic facts of fingering. Or how will I handle it? And how am I supposed to hold this and play that? And then I make a compromise because if one is staccato, the other one is legato, then how do I do? Then you put the pedal, then you start the compromise. And it's a good thing to search with a teacher, with an assistant, with a friend, with reading the text, with listening how others approached it, and perhaps ultimately finding your solution evolving in time. Therefore, I believe very much that context matters, but thinking as a composer doesn't mean that you don't play faithfully what it's composed. Even if you made a full circle in your practicing, trying to see how it could have gone, where it should have gone, why didn't go, if not having the answers, at least finding either a consequence of the thought process that led from one spot to another through a form or some sense of statement by the composer's choices. You play what's already written. You don't improvise it as a makeup without ending imitation of life. There it's complete, and you restate it as a statement that goes through the storytelling, knowing how it's going to end and pretending you don't, but you do. And therefore you organize the transitions accordingly, and the tempi and the pulse. And of course the technique of approaching it depends a lot of how much you can handle it. But the technique feeds the artistic freedom, and the artistic freedom is fed also by the curiosity as well as by the respect. It's not incompatible, and I find that Liszt encouraging students to compose was not to force them to compose. I think it was to put them in a situation where, that's what I read in it, where they can think outside the box while serving the box, if I may say so. Thank you.